If, even after all these years, the final episode of Game of Thrones still leaves you asking, what the hell just happened? You're not alone. We're right there with you. The series that once had millions and millions of people hooked for several years ended on a note that many found disappointing, but was it really that bad? In the weeks after it aired, social media and fan forums were ablaze with debates, memes, and even petitions. It's been years, yet the Game of Thrones finale remains one of the most hotly discussed conclusions in TV history. Having said that, cases can be made for and against the creative decisions that went into the making of this epic TV show. We know we might catch some flack for putting out some really unpopular opinions, but for the next few minutes, bear with us and see if you still stand by your original opinion, because in this video, we're going to discuss WTF went wrong with the finale of Game of Thrones, why it fell flat, and why it gets more hate than it deserves. But before we begin, please consider hitting those like and subscribe buttons. Those 2 small clicks from you will help us tremendously in bringing you more of these marvelous videos. And now, let's begin. The rushed race to the end. 6 episodes to wrap up a saga. If the final season of Game of Thrones felt rushed to you, you're far from alone, and honestly, the word rushed is more of an understatement of what the final season really was. I mean, all of the previous seasons were 10 episodes long, with each episode spanning around an hour, so what really was the need to wrap up such a beautifully made series with just 6 episodes? Let's for a moment forget everything. We can't deny that the show had a huge fan following. It was still a cash cow when it ended, and it's not like they didn't have the money to add 4 more episodes to the last season, right? In James Hibbard's book, Fire Cannot Kill a Dragon, Game of Thrones and the official untold story of the epic series, co-creator David Benioff said that he and Weiss did not want the show to outstay its welcome and that they wanted to leave us wanting more. Well, that does not in any way sound or smell like a proper decision, because by the time Season 8 aired, Game of Thrones was bigger and more popular than ever. There was no fatigue among fans, so the question of outstaying its welcome simply doesn't hold. It was Benioff and Weiss's decision, but I believe that even they would want to go back in time and rethink the whole thing if they could. The result of a shorter final season was that several of the plotlines zoomed by at Dragonfire speed, with little time for the nuanced character development and political intrigue that defined earlier seasons and is kinda what made the show good in the first place. The effect was felt in the final episode. We're sure it doesn't take a Batman to figure out that the pacing of the season finale was so frantic and focused on big shocks that nearly everything that happened in the finale felt sudden and unearned. In other words, events were happening to the characters faster than we could emotionally process them. They simply didn't give us, the audience, anything to absorb. I mean, especially the events like Tyrion denouncing his queen for the evil she had become, the death of Daenerys, Drogon roasting the Iron Throne like a marshmallow. All of those events should have been cooked in a low flame so that you and I had time to truly understand the gravity of them, but nope. That didn't happen. In fact, this was the trend for the entire last season. Key scenes and transitions that would have been significant were often glossed over. For instance, Jon Snow's revelation of his Targaryen parentage was something that had been built up for seasons, a narrative bombshell, if you will. However, it barely got any on-screen treatment with his sisters. The show simply never focused on Arya or Sansa's reactions. From Daenerys' ambushing King's Landing, mere episodes after the White Walker War, to characters seemingly teleporting around Westeros, Season 8 compressed what felt like 2 seasons of story into one short one. And in doing so, all sorts of logic and setup were thrown out the window. It's no surprise many fans felt the story they got in the end wasn't fully earned, but simply hurried. Daenerys' descent into Mad Queen status, earned or out of nowhere. Daenerys Targaryen's dramatic and 180-degree change of heart in the penultimate episode, The Bells, is one of the finale's most contentious points. This is the same Daenerys who spent years freeing slaves and vowing to break the wheel of tyranny, and yet in Season 8 we watched her annihilate a city of innocent people in a fit of dragonfire and rage. The question everyone immediately asked was, did this make sense for her character? Now, I'm someone who's open to her becoming the Mad Queen. I mean, she had all those darker tendencies all along. I think after her brother threatened to stick a sword in her pregnant belly, she lost it totally and didn't even flinch when Khal Drogo gave Viserys that crown of molten gold. In fact, she said she wanted to see him die, and did exactly that. Then came the Khal's death, where she burnt Mirri Maz Duur alive, which was the first execution she ordered, and this was the final nail in the coffin of her sanity. She'd been forced to run from one corner of the world to another, forced to live at the mercy of this nobleman and that nobleman. While others her age were still learning to be a lady, she was forced to marry a brute. who often started by doing brutish things to her. No wonder she became what she became, and when she finally got the opportunity to have her own army and wealth, her first instinct was often to kill noblemen and people in power, which says something about her. In fact, the more power she acquired, the more irrationally she behaved. Had it not been for people like Jorah, the Andal, Sir Barristan Selmy, Daario Naharis, Tyrion, and even Jon Snow, she would have become the murderous Mad Queen much sooner. And yet, we believe her execution she received at the hands of her nephew and lover wasn't justified in any manner whatsoever. She needed to be stopped and brought to justice, but she was a queen nonetheless, and it's not like she couldn't be reasoned with. Although, that said, we agree that would have been a mammoth task. So, when the show turned her from a flawed heroine to a mass murderer in the space of 1 or 2 episodes without any psychological unraveling, the show failed to sell the transformation. We won't deny that the show did try to build it in the final few episodes. What we mean is there were crucial beats that might have foreshadowed Dany's mental state. Let's take her grief over Ser Jorah and Missandei's deaths, her isolation in Westeros, the loss of 2 dragons, and even the distrust from the north. These were the immediate causes for her mental descent, but they were either too brief or mostly off-screen. So when she snapped above King's Landing, despite the city's surrender, many viewers were left shell-shocked in a bad way. It wasn't that the idea of Daenerys succumbing to her worst impulses was entirely off-book. The seeds of ruthlessness were planted early in her arc, but the show's rushed and problematic execution made her descent feel jarring and abrupt. By the time Jon Snow realized his queen had become a genocidal tyrant whom he must stop, you and I were still thinking, wait, how did we get here so fast? From a storytelling perspective, Dany's turn could have been a tragic masterpiece, the beloved liberator slowly consumed by her ambition and Targaryen fury. But because Season 8 went through her character development like a Formula 1 car, it felt to many like it came out of nowhere. I'm someone who's more often than not sympathetic to the writers, but even I have to admit that when Daenerys burned down King's Landing, it wasn't clear why, and the reasons provided were disappointing at best and sexist at worst. In the finale, Daenerys doubled down on her conviction that she knew what was best for the world, making grand speeches about freeing everyone. Yet, we never got a clear, intimate look into her psyche at that point. The final episode didn't redeem or explain her rampage so much as quickly remove her from the board without ever giving her a chance to reflect on or articulate her downfall. As for the initial question we raised about her transformation being earned, well, we think it wasn't, because the show utterly fumbled the necessary character work to justify her sudden madness. To sum it up, we would say that Daenerys' fate was meant to be tragic, but because of the super fast pacing, it ended up feeling tragic in the wrong way, almost as if the writers did her character a disservice. The fates of several fan-favorite characters were more compromised, less completed. With the end of Game of Thrones, we have to say goodbye to a number of amazing characters, but as you may have realized, not everyone's ending felt like a fitting song in the Westerosi Hall of Fame. For several fan-favorite characters, the finale had conclusions that ranged from bittersweet to downright obnoxious. So let's take a look at some of the more questionable story arcs, and of course, we're going to begin with Jon Snow, the once and future Aegon Targaryen, the brooding hero who'd been hailed as the prince that was promised and literally died and came back to life, ended up back where he began. After doing the dark duty of killing Daenerys, apparently for the good of the realm, Jon was condemned to the Night's Watch once more as a political compromise, and in the very last scene we see him venture north of the Wall with the wildlings, which only means that he has effectively left the Seven Kingdoms behind and will probably visit the cave with some other wildling chick, and we kinda hope this time around he won't come back to the Seven Kingdoms. On one hand, Jon heading north could be seen as him finding freedom from the Game of Thrones and finally patting Ghost, good boy, but we found this ending underwhelming. All of Jon's heroic arcs ultimately had little bearing on who ruled Westeros. I mean, if you think about it, he did go from kill the boy, let the man be born, to discovering his true heritage as the rightful and deserving king of the Seven Kingdoms, and yet he was thrown beyond the wall. That's not really a tragic Shakespearean end, but one that's blasphemous to stories altogether. It seems that after all of Jon's death, rebirth, and warfare, it seemed his whole story, it didn't matter much at all in the end. The reveal of his Targaryen lineage, hyped up for years, turned out, as Joey Tribbiani would say, it was a moot point. A cow's opinion, except as a bit of drama between him and Dany. I know that some of us who have gathered here see his fate as poetic and true to his selfless nature because, in the finale, Jon remained the tragic figure he always was, someone who saves the world from one tyrant only to be banished in penance. If you think about it, right from his birth, he was forced to face all sorts of hardships, including the hate from his mother figure, Lady Catelyn Stark, and for no fault of his own. But for us, our favorite bastard from the North deserved better. For starters, he wasn't a bastard. Even Kit Harington, who portrayed Jon, had mixed feelings and a very teary table read about where Jon ended up. At the very least, Jon's fate was bittersweet in the sense that he didn't get the throne, and I mean, honestly, thank the Seven, because that would have been a bit too cliche. Part of me, that fanboy part, still wanted him to become king. Nevertheless, we'll settle for the fact that he did get a form of freedom, a form that's highly unacceptable to us because they made him a somewhat passive figure by the very end, but it was freedom nonetheless. The next character on this list is someone who wasn't pushed into the cold desert, but brought into the sunshine. Tyrion Lannister. You have to agree, if anyone got to shine in the finale, it was Tyrion, and even his wife to an extent, or maybe his ex-wife. Anyways, our favorite clever imp survived betrayal, imprisonment, and a near execution to become the Hand once more, and this time to King Bran the Broken. We'll come back to Bran in a bit, as well as Sansa, but this episode arguably gives Tyrion more spotlight than any other character. He's the one who finds his siblings' bodies in the rubble, the one who convinces Jon to do the unthinkable with Dany, and even the one who picks the next king. In fact, Tyrion's big speech before the Dragon Pit Council, where he says that there's nothing in the world more powerful than a good story, as he nominates Bran, was the closest thing the finale had to a thesis statement. He protected King's Landing as a younger man and did not desert it when he was older and wiser. We feel Tyrion himself had a better story than most by the end. After a couple of seasons of questionable decisions, we're still annoyed about your Cersei plan, Tyrion, he more or less atoned and used his wits to secure a stable realm. It was fitting to see him straighten those chairs in the small council chamber, ready to once again drink and know things in service of a new king. That said, not everyone loved how Tyrion's arc wrapped up. His rather moving and powerful speech about stories raised some eyebrows. I mean, was the show patting itself on the back? Was Bran has the best story really convincing when Arya killed the Night King and Jon literally came back from the dead, a bastard boy who had a shot at the Iron Throne? So yeah, if you think that Tyrion's monologue in the final episode was slightly hollow and self-congratulatory, you're not alone. Still, Peter Dinklage delivered the material with his usual gravitas, and seeing Tyrion survive and even find a measure of purpose felt satisfying to us. In the end, Tyrion is arguably the MVP of the finale. He lives, we hope he learns, and he's left to guide Westeros into a new age. A decent outcome for the last Lannister standing after what the two queens did and the few kings before them, including the two bastards and one mad king. Since we're already talking about Tyrion, let's take Sansa next. Sansa Stark. Of all the Starks, Sansa arguably got the happiest ending and the one most true to her journey. She survives countless horrors and power games to become the Queen in the North, reclaiming her family's rule and securing independence for the North at the Council. Sansa's coronation, with the crown braided into her hair and all that, was a satisfying moment, like finding water in a desert, especially for people like you and me who watched her evolve from a naive girl who wanted to bear pretty little children for the king into a capable, steely leader. No one works harder for the North than Sansa, and seeing that, we know that her queenship was completely deserved. Indeed, Sansa's insistence that the North will not bend the knee again, even to her own brother, underscores how far she'd come in understanding and asserting the needs of her people. The finale doesn't linger long on her rule, but we can imagine Sansa ushering in a just and prosperous era for Winterfell. If there's any criticism here, it's minor. The show glosses over why the other kingdoms were fine with Sansa's North alone getting to secede, the Brexit jokes write themselves, but in general, even the staunchest finale skeptics tend to agree Sansa's ending made sense and was satisfying. After all she'd endured, the Lady of Winterfell became the Queen, no Iron Throne necessary. In the grand scheme, Sansa's arc was one of the few that the finale didn't fumble, delivering a payoff that felt earned through her growth and resilience. But the issue we have is that several arcs in the source material hint that she might be being set up as the primary villain in the story, someone who believes what she is doing is right and doesn't care what measures she has to take in order to achieve her objectives. Kinda like what became of Dany. Now, if Mr. Martin does not complete his stories, we'll never know, and this is the story we'll end up with for Sansa. However, speaking of Sansa would always be incomplete if we didn't talk about her sister, Arya Stark. It's strange for someone like Arya, who's all about avenging those who hurt her family, that she never really had the Night King on her little list. I mean, the Night King had come not only for her family, but for the entire North. Nevertheless, she did manage to kill the biggest threat to Westeros, maybe even Essos, even though the Night King was not on her list. Arya ends her journey by turning her back on the whole feudal mess and sailing off into the unknown. She became an adventurer and discoverer from being a mercenary. In the finale, Arya decides to explore what's west of Westeros, presumably because after saving the world and avenging her family, everyday life in Winterfell would bore our adventurous assassin to tears. This ending could mean two things. First, they just wanted to reinforce the fact that Arya was an independent spirit, and second, it could be a setup for an as-of-yet unrealized spin-off. On one level, Arya's wanderlust makes sense because she's always been too restless and hardened by trauma to play the lady of a castle. We think it fits that Arya doesn't settle down, but instead sails into the sunset like a Frodo Baggins, having seen too much to return to normalcy. We last see her on a Stark-branded ship, headed west with a determined expression on her face and a smile that screams freedom. The simplicity of Arya's goodbye, that is, without any throne or ambition for it, without any romantic reunion, and just some good old wanderlust and hunger for adventure, felt true to her character. So it's safe to say that her arc didn't so much resolve as continue off-screen into uncharted waters. But you know what? We want to ask whatever happened to that faceless man magic, but we're not going to push it because in a series notorious for killing Starks, we're grateful that Arya survived and stayed true to herself. A bit anticlimactic, but bearable, especially compared to two people who really had their sorry conclusions in the show, Jaime and Cersei Lannister. If any character endings infuriated a large segment of the fandom, it was this incestuous duo. Jaime Lannister spent 7 seasons evolving from a king-slaying, child-tossing villain to a redeemed hero who earned Brienne's love and appeared to find his honor at last. And then, in the final hours of Season 8, he abruptly U-turned and ran back to Cersei, unable to quit his toxic soulmate. We were left deflated, if not outright enraged, to see Jaime's hard-won character growth seemingly thrown away, and odds are you feel the same way as us. In the end, he died in Cersei's arms as King's Landing collapsed around them, exactly where he started, hopelessly devoted to his sister lover. The poetic symmetry might have been intentional, but it felt like a tragic regression. Cersei, for her part, did little but smirk from a balcony for most of Season 8, only to cry and cling to Jaime in her final moments. What a shame for a Lion Queen who, not very long ago, didn't concern herself with the opinion of the sheep. For a character who had been a magnificently ruthless villain, Cersei's death under a pile of bricks struck us as a huge anticlimax. She didn't get a final move to make or a satisfying comeuppance, that's unless you count gravity as the executioner. Jokes apart, even Tyrion's tearful discovery of his siblings' corpses couldn't redeem the feeling that Cersei Lannister, one of the show's most formidable antagonists, went out with a whimper instead of a roar. The choice to have Jaime and Cersei die together was undoubtedly romantic in a twisted way, but it robbed Jaime of the chance to truly break free of his past. Many fans would have preferred to see him solidify his redemption, perhaps fighting heroically at Winterfell, then staying in the north with Brienne. Instead, love conquered honor and became the death of duty. Bran the Broken. The decision to make Bran Stark the King of Westeros in Game of Thrones was, to put it mildly, a frustrating one for many. While the show's plot often thrived on the unexpected, Bran's ascension felt less like the end of a well-earned journey and more like the writers running out of ideas. For a character whose arc seemed sidelined for seasons, when you turn him into the ruler of the Seven Kingdoms, it feels underwhelming. And that's not just because Bran was kind of, dull by the end of the story. Up until the final season, Bran's story had been full of potential. He had mystical powers, he could see through time itself and warg into animals, but instead of using these abilities to help with the war or uncover crucial secrets, he spent a lot of time being cryptic and rather detached. Why? By the time we reached that final episode, it seemed Bran was little more than a walking plot device. He could see everything, but somehow he didn't share any of his visions until it was too late, which left his potential largely untapped. And let's not even get started on his first council meeting, where he failed to offer any leadership despite his knowledge. He was the king of least resistance, a guy who didn't really want the job, didn't have any real alliances, and didn't seem to inspire anyone. Sure, Bran wasn't plagued by the usual hunger for power that doomed past rulers, but his disconnect from humanity and his lack of interest in ruling felt more like a vice than a virtue. He wasn't just Bran anymore, he was the three-eyed raven, a being with no personal desires, which, in theory, could make him a perfect king, but this cold detachment made his rule feel mechanical and unearned. The issue here wasn't just Bran's character, it was the show's rush to an ending without properly setting it up. While George R.R. Martin has hinted at Bran's role in the books, Game of Thrones dropped the ball on various occasions. In the books, Bran's storyline is woven into the larger fabric of Westeros with much more depth, which would make his rise more plausible, believable, and acceptable. But enough about humans and oracles, let's talk about the biggest anticlimax after years of build-up and hope. Of course, we're talking about the Night King and the White Walkers. Winter is coming. For 7 years, these 3 words and the overarching threat of the White Walkers loomed large over the 7 kingdoms, the show, and us. In fact, if you remember the very first scene, you'd remember how it introduced us to the undead and the risk they posed to all of humanity. From that moment onwards, it became clear that one day there would be a huge war between the living and the dead, a war that would be equal parts satisfying and thrilling. Naturally, we all waited years for the long night to descend, and when it finally did in Season 8, it came and went in a single episode. To us, that was the biggest anticlimax of all. We felt cheated. How could you do that after 8 years of buildup? How could the White Walker army get destroyed in a single episode, and that too at Arya's hands? And once that was done, they all conveniently forgot the White Walker threat and started playing the Game of Thrones again. I mean, after defeating such a huge foe and taking care of such a big risk, we expected people to take a moment and really decide if infighting was the best way forward, but it seems the makers of the show did not have this foresight. This quick victory over the Walkers felt incredibly underwhelming, and the rejoicing henceforth was short-lived. We'd been told again and again that the living needed to band together or die because this enemy was unlike any other. Yet, when push came to shove, the supposedly unstoppable Night King turned out to be about as fragile as a video game boss. You kill him and his whole undead legion conveniently falls apart. Indeed, the show unintentionally made the White Walkers too easy to defeat. An ancient and mysterious force of pure evil was vanquished by one dagger stuck into their leader, and that was that. The Night King himself never said a word or revealed any deeper motive beyond evil for evil's sake. Years of theorizing about his purpose or possible connection to Bran Stark went nowhere. So much for those Bran is the Night King speculations. In storytelling terms, the Great War ended up feeling like a footnote to the more mundane politics. Even within the show, characters like Davos had stressed that the Game of Thrones wouldn't matter if the dead won, but then the dead lost so swiftly that the Game of Thrones did matter after all. It was almost like, oh, fellow men, women, and children, look out, the ultimate evil is coming. Never mind, back to King's Landing politics. Then there's the issue of the Children of the Forest and other stuff related to the Whites. Like, why build the mythology of the children creating the Night King, tease things like Craster's baby sacrifices, or show us spirals of body parts in the snow if absolutely none of it would factor into the endgame? The show never answered many of these questions, and in the end, who sat on the throne mattered more than who defeated death incarnate, and that's kinda sad. Now that we think about it, the defeat of the White Walkers had less of a lasting impact on us and the 7 kingdoms than, say, Cersei blowing up the Sept of Baelor or Arya taking care of House Frey. So yes, winter came, but it was gone by dawn. The supposed long night was, as one fan put it, not that long. Was the destruction of the Iron Throne symbolism or a cop-out? In the climax of the finale, after Jon Snow has tragically fulfilled his duty and Daenerys lies dead, her last living dragon expresses its grief and rage in a pretty darn dramatic fashion. Drogon melts the Iron Throne into a molten mess with his fiery breath. The same dragon fire that once forged the Iron Throne became the source of its destruction. This wordless moment was arguably the most overt piece of symbolism in the entire series. The Iron Throne, that spiky chair forged from 1,000 swords, literally gets blown to bits. The clear message that came from it was that the endless cycle of war and political backstabbing over that chair is broken. By roasting the throne, Drogon was, intentionally or not, breaking the wheel that Dany once spoke of. Drogon understood that it was this throne and the hunger for power it brought that ultimately killed his mother, and not Jon. The dragon basically took up the anti-fascist position and directed his fire at the seat of power instead of the man standing next to his mother's corpse, despite knowing it was this man who killed her. We're okay with this take, but for many others, this scene was less, wow, so deep, and more, wait, do dragons understand metaphors now? Drogon's destruction of the throne felt to some as a cheap cop-out by the writers, a way to remove the eponymous object from the board so that they wouldn't have to address who physically claims it. After all, if the throne is melted, no one technically sits on it, which also means that there would be no further conquests. It also conveniently allowed Jon Snow to survive the encounter, but let's be honest, by all rights, Drogon should have been furious at Jon for stabbing Daenerys, but instead of charbroiling Jon, the dragon turns and spews fire at the big pointy chair. Like, what? The show offers no explicit explanation for why Drogon spared Jon. Even Jon was as surprised and shocked as we are. I mean, that guy was all like, I'm toast, and probably prepared himself mentally for becoming toast. But when that didn't happen, we're sure a small part of him felt slightly disappointed at what a sissy this big dragon turned out to be. But there could be several reasons behind Drogon's decision, perhaps because Jon was a Targaryen, or he knew that his mother had turned into a piece of crap ruler. Either way, it felt a bit ridiculous to some that a beast would understand the nuances of human power politics, and we understand that. The show couldn't expect you to accept that Drogon had a quasi-human level of insight in that instance across the length of a single scene, barring the one scene where Tyrion says the dragons, according to some maesters, are smarter than humans. The throne itself was the ultimate casualty of all the scheming and war. It's as if the Iron Throne itself got scapegoated for all of Dany's actions, and because of that, Drogon and the writers went all bad throne. You corrupted her, and practically speaking, it avoided an even messier aftermath. Can you begin to imagine what Grey Worm would have done to protect what belonged to his queen? By having Drogon melt the throne and then carry Dany's body away, the episode took care of any uncomfortable scenes between the Unsullied and the Dothraki on one hand, and the rest of the Westerosi armies on the other. What would George R.R. Martin have done? Ever since the show raced beyond the narratives of George R.R. Martin's published books, fans have speculated how differently things might have gone under the source material's guidance. Now, with the series finale's controversies, that speculation is in overdrive. George R.R. Martin, the very man behind A Song of Ice and Fire, has yet to publish the final two novels, namely The Winds of Winter and A Dream of Spring. So the ending that millions saw on HBO is, in a sense, an ending all right, but not the ending Martin intends for his saga. The biggest question is, would Martin's version address the issues that plagued the show's finale? In other words, what might the author have done differently or similarly? For starters, Martin himself has gently acknowledged that the show's compression of the story was not ideal. The author rather diplomatically said that David Benioff and D.B. Weiss had about 6 hours for the final season of the show, whereas he expects the story in his last 2 books to span thousands of pages. That right there already implies a major difference. Martin's ending, if and when it comes, will be much more fleshed out. He's writing in a medium where he can add as many chapters as needed, following multiple characters' internal journeys. The show had to cut to the chase. Martin can take the scenic route. It's easy to imagine that many plot developments that felt abrupt on TV, like Daenerys' downward spiral, for example, would be given far more gradual build-up in the books. In fact, some of the groundwork is already laid on the page. For example, Dany's book portrayal has darker foreshadowings, but the why and how of her turn could be explored in much greater depth by Martin's prose. Likewise, characters like Jon, Arya, Tyrion, and Bran have ongoing arcs in the books that diverge significantly from the show's later seasons. The butterfly effect, as Martin calls it, means there are characters alive in the books that never made it to the show, and events that unfolded differently, or not at all, in the HBO version. Will the ultimate destination be the same? Martin has indicated that some major endpoints will align. He said he told the showrunners the broad strokes of his intended ending, but also that there will be differences. In his playful, coy way, he responded to people asking if the books will end like the show by saying yes and no, and yes and no, and yes and no. In other words, it's complicated. It's very likely that King Bran, for instance, is one of Martin's planned endgame twists, since that seems too specific to have been purely a show invention. But how Bran gets that crown on his head in the books might feel more convincing with the benefit of Martin's storytelling. The same goes for Daenerys. Her fate might ultimately be the same tragic fall, but perhaps with additional context, prophecies, or intrigues that make it feel more organically earned. Also, the books have significant players that the show omitted who could dramatically alter the story. Think of Lady Stoneheart carrying out vengeful Red Wedding justice, or the young Aegon Targaryen, a supposed Targaryen heir in the books who isn't even in the show. Such elements could very well change how the finale shakes out. Oh, and for those of you who don't know, Lady Stoneheart is basically Catelyn Stark brought back from the dead, the same way Jon and Beric Dondarrion were brought back. She's a total badass, and she's gonna do some badass stuff by the end of the story. Legacy of the finale. Why fans still debate it. It's been years since Game of Thrones aired its final episode, but if you bring up the finale in a room full of fans, the debates could get more heated than the flames of Balerion the Black Dread. The legacy of the Game of Thrones finale is, in a word, infamy. Rarely has a pop culture phenomenon seen such an abrupt turnaround in fan sentiment at the very end. Within days of the finale, over 1 million viewers signed a petition demanding HBO remake Season 8 from scratch. Yes, really. finale. On Reddit and social media, fans poured out wrath and sorrow, dissecting every perceived plot hole and character assassination. Memes comparing Season 8 to a dumpster fire became common. In online rankings of worst season finales, Game of Thrones now routinely gets dishonorable mentions alongside the likes of Dexter and Lost. In short, the ending landed with a dull thud for a huge portion of the fandom, and people have not been quiet about it. So why does the debate refuse to die down? For one, the disappointment was proportional to how much people loved the show before. Game of Thrones wasn't just any TV series. It was a global cultural event, a show that had built up an incredible amount of goodwill and fan investment. When the ending seemingly undermined a lot of what came before by rushing the story, by making heroes do inexplicable things, by leaving big questions unresolved, it felt to many like a personal betrayal. Fans had given a decade of loyalty, and they expected the same care in return. Instead, a sizable segment felt that the creators fumbled at the 1-yard line. You can't make 100% of people happy, but David Benioff and D.B. Weiss sure got close to making 100% of people hate them with that shitty finale. Another reason the finale remains a hot topic is because the conversation around it keeps evolving. Immediately after it aired, there was a lot of shock and anger, but in the years since, we've seen some reassessment and continued dialogue. A portion of the fandom, perhaps in the minority but vocal, actually defends the finale's outcomes, if not the execution. Oh, and I, for one, am one of them. What I argue is that, looking back, the ending did tie into the series' themes. The futility of war and power was symbolized by the melted throne, the idea that the best ruler might be someone who doesn't want power is when we say hello to Bran, and the Starks ultimately find their destinies as rulers, explorers, etc. Personally, we don't think that the finale betrayed the show's primary themes. In fact, it gave satisfying conclusions to many arcs, if not all. In other words, not everyone sees it as a total disaster. The very divisiveness of the finale ensures that it stays in the public discourse. A truly universally hated or beloved ending wouldn't spark such ongoing analysis, but one that splits the fanbase becomes almost a Rorschach test for what people value in storytelling. So, did Benioff and Weiss actually make a good decision by making a bad one? At least their work is still relevant enough to have at least 2 spin-offs, one with an upcoming 3rd season and one that's been confirmed. We're talking about A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, The Hedge Knight. The cast and crew's reactions have also kept the finale in the news here and there. Over time, actors like Emilia Clarke and Kit Harington have spoken in interviews about the backlash. Clarke empathetically said that she understood the upset. At one point, she even joked that Jon Snow got away with murder since her character faced the brunt of the fallout. Sophie Turner, who played Sansa, on the other hand, bristled at fans' disrespect towards the crew's hard work and called the petition quote-unquote sad, which in turn fueled more fan discussion about whether the backlash was justified or toxic. Even the normally tight-lipped showrunners eventually commented, albeit briefly, on the controversy. Their stance was essentially that it was an intense response and you can't please everyone, but many fans felt they were downplaying the scale of the backlash, but they kinda acted as if it was a mixed response or slight backlash. Well, the truth is that we've never seen such a widespread, devastating wave of hatred for a TV show before. In the end, the Game of Thrones finale is a case study in how a conclusion can transform a fandom, in this case, uniting them in debate, if not in praise. Some fans have made peace with it, others remain bitter, many just love to argue about it. One might say the showrunners succeeded in one unintended way. They ensured people would be talking about their finale for a long, long time. As George R.R. Martin himself wryly predicted, everyone is making up their own mind and arguing about it on the internet indefinitely. Love it or hate it, the final chapter of Game of Thrones left a mark on television history as a pop culture WTF moment that we're still hashing out long after the credits rolled and the Iron Throne melted away. That's all we got for you this time, but if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Otherwise, thanks for watching, stay safe out there, and have a marvelous night.